Good afternoon and welcome to Election Bites. We're so glad to be back this year, 2022, for a new series and season of conversations headed into the November election process. This season, we're kicking off our conversations with a focus on Georgia, voting in Georgia, what's new in 2022. And we are really thrilled to be joined by Leah Maravaki, who is an assistant professor in American politics at Mississippi State University and a member of the Carter Center's expert team. Welcome, Leah.
Nice to be here.
So, just to sort of help give us a little bit of context, we know that Georgia's election law changes that occurred in 2021 have gotten a lot of national attention over the last 12 months or so. But what's been happening in the rest of the country? Can you help put this into context for us? What are some of the trends you've seen around the country when it comes to voting changes since the 2020 elections?
Thanks, Avery. That's a great question. Let me preface my answer by saying that the 2020 election was the most pro-voter access election we have had in a while, mainly because most states relaxed their voting policies to make it easier for voters to cast a vote in person and by mail. Drop boxes, curbside voting, vote centers, easier mail ballot request policies, online ballot tracking. These are just a few of the many innovation states implemented in 2020. So some states enacted these policies temporarily. Post 2020, therefore, they just went back to their established policies. But some substantially amended established policies that they had before, which add more steps for voters to take. And that's why it can make it difficult for voters to participate. Some obvious trends, amendments to the mail voting process, such as narrowing the list of acceptable excuses to request a mail ballot, like Texas is doing that, or requiring voters to include additional information on their absentee applications and their ballot. Georgia and Florida are doing that. Another big trend is the regulation of drop boxes. They were very popular in 2020. Many states like Iowa, Texas, Florida, Georgia are removing them or limiting their use, citing concerns about fraud. The most consistent trend, aside from mail voting policies, is the prohibition of the use of private funds for election administration, on which thousands and thousands of local jurisdictions relied on in 2020 to make elections work.
Thanks, Leah. So I'm a Georgia voter, and I'd love to hear what you think are the sort of top three changes that I need to know or other Georgia voters need to know about the election process and how it will impact voters this year.
Good question. It is important to know that even the most minute election law changes can confuse voters and can either deter participation or increase the risk of making an error, which can then invalidate a vote. The first one, top one on my list in Georgia, has to do with voting by mail. Now voters have a smaller window of time to request their mail ballot to Fridays before November 8th. They are also must provide additional identification information when they request an absentee ballot and when they return it. The second change affects the use of drop boxes, which, as I said, were very popular in 2020. Now, every county must have at least one, but there is a cap on how many are available depending on the number of registered voters. Voters can return their ballot only using a drop box during times when the polling location is open during early in-person voting. So there are significant changes that regulate mail and drop boxes. Top three change affects in-person voting on my list. Georgia counties now have to offer early in-person voting the Saturday prior to election day, which is a big change. Also, they have the option of having voting hours on a Sunday. Because there's flexibility on the county side on whether they're going to implement that or not, especially for a Sunday, this will create different voting patterns across Georgia. An additional change about early voting, about in-person voting, is that voters who turn out to vote at the wrong precinct will have to vote provisionally, and their vote will not count because in the past their count would be able to be counted. Unless voters turn out to vote after 5 p.m. and sign a statement saying that this location is the closest I could go to and vote at this time, their provisional ballot will count. So that's my top three.
Thanks, Leah. That's really helpful. So it's important, seems like it's really important to sort of check with your county election offices about when early voting is going to be taking place, where it's happening, where drop boxes are, some of those details so that you can be prepared when it's time for you to cast your ballot.
Mhm.
Sort of changing course a little bit, there is an increasing news coverage of voter challenges happening in counties across Georgia. What are these challenges, and what should you do if your voter status is challenged?
That's a great question, Avery. And we see a lot of stories coming out of Georgia at the moment around this topic. Under the new Georgia law, any registered voter in a specific county or a locality has the jurisdiction to challenge the eligibility of a registered voter in writing before election day and even on election day. If these challenges take place prior to election day, election officials must conduct a hearing before election day, and they can invite witnesses and give the opportunity to voters to present their case, but the burden of proof lies on the challenger. Now, the tricky thing can be what happens when the challenge is submitted very close to election day. It's not very clear how much time election officials have to conduct a hearing to schedule it and inform the challenged voter in writing. There is also every registered voter has the discretion or ability under this law to challenge a voter at the polling place before they actually cast their vote. So it is important to know that the law says the burden of proof lies on the challenger, but the challenged voter also has the opportunity to present their case. And on election day, voters can have their voter ID and any documentation they can have in order to prove, which is not the most appropriate word to use, but basically to verify their identity so that they are able to cast a vote.
Thanks. And so having your ID, obviously in Georgia is a voter ID state, so hopefully if you're voting in person, you'll have that with you anyway because you'll need it. But is there other documentation, maybe a utility bill or something that would show proof of residency that could also be helpful to have?
That's a great question. Considering that these challenges basically rely on some skepticism as to whether the voter is eligible to vote in a specific jurisdiction, having additional information as to verify where you live, that you are a registered voter in a specific county, that is undoubtedly helpful. Now, of course, that increases the steps a voter has to take in potential anticipation of being challenged, and that is unfortunate. But if a voter is challenged, and they should be informed before they go at the polling place, but even if they go, it is useful to have those documentation handy so that you can resolve those issues if they arise.
Thanks, Leah. Sort of building on that, and last question. Based on the changes to the election law, what advice would you give to voters in Georgia as they are making their plans to vote this November?
Thank you, Avery. And this is very, very important. That's a very important question. The new Georgia law changes several things in the election process, from what is needed to vote, when to vote, how to submit the ballot, how election officials prepare and conduct elections, which protocols poll watchers or registered voters in the county have to follow when observing or when they are concerned about election integrity. But the one piece of advice I have is that there are also several efforts to ensure that voters are informed about these changes and that they cast a vote that will count. Of course, we have to pay attention at which practices improve the quality of elections and the voter experience and which do not. And we have to evaluate after the election so that we make improvements for the next. But a big power that voters have is information. Stay informed, contact your local election officials, your state election official, clarify what you need to do in order to vote, and be prepared to handle everything that may come your way so that you are able to cast your vote uninterrupted.
Thanks, Leah. Thank you so much for joining us for this election bite, and thank you to our audience for joining us too. Please join us for another bite-sized conversation in your lunch hour next week when we will be speaking with David Becker on lies, damn lies, and myths about our electoral process. We look forward to seeing you then.